suggest to you is that the juridical vocabulary that Kant uses in the Critique of Pure Reason is formally analogous to the juridical vocabulary that he uses in the Doctrine of Right. Now, this should not come as a surprise. There is a way in which, of course, the Doctrine of Right is a later work than the Critique of Pure Reason, and it is a familiar thought that Kant regards the Critique of Pure Reason and the Transcendental Analytic in particular as a kind of general apparatus for all of philosophy. So it's not surprising that the Critique of the Pure Reason's vocabulary recurs there. And so there are, for example, deductions again. There are synthetic a priori principles again, and there are worries and warnings and cautions against subrections. But if we see that this is the way in which that apparatus is brought to bear on, say, at its original case, the case in which the juridical vocabulary is first introduced, we get a better understanding of how that vocabulary operates, and so a better understanding more generally of the critical project as a whole. Now, you might say, look, the Critique of Pure Reason was published in 1781, the Doctrine of Right wasn't published until 1787. Why think that he had this in mind? And the answer is, I'm not offering a biographical hypothesis about Immanuel Kant. I'm offering an analytical approach to reading the Critique of Pure Reason. Alan Wood, who is sitting here in front of all of us because he's in the front row, has a wonderful paper called How to Read Dead Philosophers, in which he suggests that one thing to keep in mind is that in reading a philosophical text, you can appeal to machinery that might not have been fully available to the philosopher at the time that that philosopher wrote that text. Alan gives the wonderful example, wonderful in multiple ways, of Michael Della Rocca's use of Quine's idea of referential opacity in order to explicate a passage in Spinoza. It's made extra wonderful given the contempt with which Quine held the entire history of philosophy, and it turns out the most useful thing that he has to contribute to philosophy is making sense of a historical text. But more than that, it suggests that the fact that the apparatus was not fully available does not mean that it can't be illuminated. So here we have a case where the apparatus was not fully available in the written version of these remarks. I actually give some evidence that a lot of it was already available by 1781, that in fact Kant's view about right was largely developed by 1784, though not completely developed, but that the relevant contrasts are already there. But I'm not going to try and make that case here. My point instead is that if we suppose that Kant is redeploying the apparatus of the transcendental deduction in what he describes as the deduction of the titles of right, then we will understand how it is supposed to work in the case that is, in some sense, its basic case, though not the case for the sake of which he introduces. So that's the plan. What is the payoff of the plan? The payoff of the plan is, first of all, we come up with a new way of thinking about what's going on in the Doctrine of Right. We come up with an explanation of something that has been raised repeatedly as a challenge to Kant's so-called argument for property, the Doctrine of Right, because many people say, oh, look, we could just treat Kant as a kind of hyper-technical lock, and we can just go from your right to your own person to the need for the state, because it turns out we disagree about that. We can see why that can't be Kant's argument once we understand the nature of the deduction. For readers of the Critique of Pure Reason, we get a satisfying argument in another way, because it lets us understand several striking things about the Critique of Pure Reason, to which I'll return at the end. First of all, it lets us understand why the transcendental deduction is not, as Peter Strawson put it, an exercise in the imaginary subject of transcendental psychology, or as Wilfrid Sellars marginally more sympathetically put it, it is not an exercise in the, Strawson calls it the imaginary subject, Sellers calls it the fictitious mental machinery. And I mean, there's a question, you read this stuff, there's all this stuff going on. The imagination is doing this, the unity of apperception is doing that. It all sounds very psychological, and it doesn't sound very philosophical, and lots of people wonder about what's going on. And then people go off in other directions. The kind of broadly Heideggerian reading of the critique says, oh, there's this primordial level, and it's just more mechanism, except the mechanism is this time knowing how to ride a bicycle or operate a screwdriver or saw. And you think, no, that isn't what he's doing. And we can see why that isn't what he's doing. And we can see, I'll suggest, why the transcendental deduction is, as Kant announces, a progressive argument without it being a deductive. So that's the payoff. And now here's the plan. First thing I'm going to do is talk about the idea of synthesis as it occurs in Kant, using the example of right in order to explain it. Then I am going to, having introduced the idea of synthesis, I'm then going to explain why a synthesis requires a deduction. I am then going to briefly digress and talk about the historical concept of a deduction in 18th century law. And then I am going to go through briefly Kant's deduction in the Doctrine of Right of the titles of private right. And I'm going to suggest that it has a certain structure to it. And then I am going to demonstrate that the same structure is the organizing structure of the B deduction. I have a view about how the A deduction maps onto this, but that would be getting too much into the weeds. And then I am going to demonstrate all of the things that has all of the payoffs that I have promised. So first, the idea of a synthesis. A synthesis, Kant tells us, connects something to something distinct from it. Now, we can see this in a completely familiar kind of legal case, a legal case that will be familiar to all of you. If you and I have a contract, your right under the contract connects two things. It connects the process of contract formation, you and I having come to an agreement and a bilateral exchange of terms, with my future performance. And so there is, for the keeping of any contract, a synthetic a priori rule. That rule we can dignify by giving it a Latin name, pacta sunt servanda. Promises are to be kept. And how do we understand that? What it does, it connects something to something distinct from it. Notice that there's a puzzle about how something can be connected practically to something distinct from it. Because it seems as though whenever I assert a claim, when I say, well, you promise, there is a challenge you can raise. Now, all of you are morally upright people and you won't raise the challenge, but note that the challenge comes up simply as a matter of intelligibility, not as a matter of objection. The question is, well, what's that to me? And the synthetic principle is supposed to tell you what that is to you. That you promised that we had a contract somehow is supposed to connect this past thing to this future thing. Now, this principle, pacta sunt servanda, is synthetic. Why is it synthetic? Because the past action and the future action are distinct things. One is not, to use one of Kant's multiple formulations of the idea of an analytic judgment, one is not contained in the other. They're distinct from each other. If they're distinct from each other, what the rule pacta sunt servanda does is connect them to each other. So it's synthetic, but it's also a priori, it seems. Why is it a priori? Well, as Hume famously put it in criticizing Locke in his wonderful essay of the original contract, it's not that we promise to keep our promises. Promissory obligation, contractual obligation, it's not the result of a transaction. It's rather the principle pacta sunt servanda it's a rule about transactions. But although it's a rule about transaction, it is not itself the product of a particular transaction. We're not going to be able to come up with an explanation of its bindingness that appeals to it, nor are we going to be able to come up with any other kind of merely empirical explanation of its bindingness. Because the principle pacta sunt servanda at least purports to have the other two marks of an a priori principle. That is, it has both strict universality and necessity. It has strict universality, not because it covers every imaginable case of promising, not because you always have to keep your promise come what may. It has universality because its bindingness doesn't depend on the particulars. It works in just the same way within whatever its scope is. So it is a rule for connecting things to others. So that's the most familiar example of a synthetic a priori principle, and Kant expressly calls these synthetic a priori principles for private right. But let me just draw your attention to the two others to which he refers. The first of those is the rule of property. The rule of property says, if I own this water bottle, which actually probably just a Bailey of it, but if I own this water bottle, I get to set the terms on which others may interact. So I have the right to exclude you from it, which means that it's up to me what happens with it. So here again, we can see that this is a synthetic principle. It somehow connects my acquisition of the water bottle, however it came about, to your use of the water bottle. And again, you might wonder, what's that to me? What do I care about you having acquired it? And indeed, the pre-critical Kant seemed to think that there was some connection between me and the water bottle that you had to respect. And Kant now, no, that can't be it at all. There has to be something else. So we have a synthetic principle. Don't interfere with the property of others. It is a priori because it's not that we acquired it. It's rather that we somehow are bound by it. And that means we need to explain it. And that means, notice, that it requires a deduction. The same thing applies with respect to what Kant calls relations of status. The basic idea with multiple variants is that when you are in charge of some aspect of another person's affairs, you cannot use the powers that you have for your private advantage. University of California system envelopes used to say on them, penalty for private use, $500. You're not allowed to privatize your role as trustee of some aspect of another person's affairs. If you are fixing my bicycle, you are allowed to take it for a diagnostic test ride, but you are not allowed to use it to visit your elderly relative or to deliver Meals on Meals, even though those might be more important things. Again, there is somehow a connection. How do we understand the connection? The connection requires a deduction. So let me now bring this idea of synthesis very briefly to bear on the categories of the understanding, and I'll focus only on the categories of relation here, both to keep things manageable, but also because they strictly correspond to the three titles of private right. Substance corresponds to property, Kant claims, causality corresponds to contract, and community corresponds to status. But notice, with respect to each of these relations, we can ask, how is this thing having a property, this substance having an accident, how are they connected? We can ask, how are cause and effect connected? Because notice that cause and effect are the causal relation is a synthetic a priori rule for connecting something to something else. In the introduction to the B edition, Kant gives the example of relative and genuine a priori judgment with a house collapse. The house collapses And we can say, oh, I knew it was going to happen because the foundation was defective. That's relatively a priori. That's based on something you know about houses. But notice, that's a relative a priori empirical principle. But notice that there is a synthetic a priori principle that underlies your deployment of that more specific principle. That's the principle that says, to put it in the most generic terms imaginable, things happen because of other things, or stuff happens, more generic still, stuff happens because of other stuff. Question, are we entitled to this particular judgment that the house collapsed because of its defective foundation, or that my rash developed because of the shampoo I'm using? Only if we're entitled to the claim that stuff happens because of other stuff. But now, notice that we can ask not only about the particular, but again, about the genuine point. Now, this brings me to the transcendental deduction. Opening paragraph of the transcendental deduction. Jurists, when asserting and distinguishing legal claims, draw a distinction between the quid iuris, the question of law, by what right does someone do this, and the quid facti, the question of fact with respect to the particulars. So notice that this quid iuris, quid facti distinction fits all of our examples so far. That is, the principle, you want to know why you have to cut my lawn next Wednesday. It is because of the quid iuris that says pacta sunt servanda, promises are to be kept. Do you not want to know why you have to refrain from interfering with my water bottle? That's because of the quid iuris, the synthetic principle that says property is not to be interfered with. Notice, however, that there is still this secondary question, not merely by what right do I claim this water bottle, or do I demand that you cut my lawn? Good deal for you, my lawn is in Toronto, hasn't been weeks. But by what right do I require you to do that? But there's still the question, by what right? There is, that is, the quid iuris of the quid iuris. So now, I've begun to introduce the analogy by showing that they are asking the same kind of question. Notice also that I have begun to introduce the analogy by showing how the two parts are actually, well, the two cases, are both involved in the resolution of a possible dispute. You want to know, well, why do you think that's? You say to the dermatologist, why do you think it's my shampoo? You say to me, why do I have to cut the lawn? We have a dispute, and there is a principle we can appeal to in order to bring facts to bear on our dispute. The quid facti only matters against the background of the quid iuris. So I now want to talk very briefly about the difference between this way of thinking about it and what I will characterize as the dominant version of the metaphorical interpretation of Kant's juridical vocabulary. That is the interpretation proposed in a famous article by Dieter Henrich in the late 1970s called Kant's Deductions and the Concept of a Deduction. And Henrich suggests that we have to understand Kant's juridical vocabulary metaphorically, and he did a certain amount of historical research on 18th century deductions in order to come up with this proposal. And so Henrich's view, to put it in the briefest possible compass, is that a deduction is a genre of persuasive writing. He says that transcendental deduction is not meant to be a deductive argument. It's meant to be like the deductions introduced by the Göttingen jurist Johann Hutter, which are supposed to be a kind of legal brief. And he suggests that, although Kant never says this, that Kant admired this as a style of writing, admired the jurists, and so wanted to convince his readers who would be familiar with this excellent sample of writing that this was the standard to which his transcendental deduction conforms. Henrich mentions a number of examples, mostly deductions collected by Putter and one deduction written by Putter. I want to give a different example, partly because Putter's deductions are, I think, less vivid, because actually as deduction, probably less well written than some of the others, but also because the deduction that I want to discuss is by far the most important deduction of the 18th century. And it is one that, although Kant does not expressly refer to it, it has features to which Kant expressly refers in a not entirely flattering manner. This is the deduction offered by Frederick the Great on the occasion of the invasion of Silesia. Silesia was a province of the Habsburg Empire when Queen Maria Theresa ascended the Habsburg throne. Frederick the Great said, "This does not belong to you, this belongs to me." And how did he do this? Well, it turned out that one Johann Ludwig was the chancellor of the University of Halle, had been working for over a decade on preparing this deduction. It was not a hastily prepared document, but it was released actually after the invasion or in the course of the invasion. And so what did the deduction do? It basically recited a series of transactions. It said, well, look, our common ancestor, King Georg, purchased Silesia for good value in the year 1524. Having purchased it for good value, it was then inherited by this person, inherited by that person, and so on, up to the point at which my grandfather gave it to your grandfather as part of a peace negotiation. But my grandfather gave it to your grandfather as part of a peace negotiation as a defeasible gift. He gave it with a mental reservation that he did not intend property to vest if there was not a male heir on the Habsburg side. So notice several things about this argument. So I don't tell you about this just for its entertainment, though, but I won't pretend that it's not entertainment. But first thing to notice about it is that it has a sharp demarcation between quid facti and quid iuris, because it appeals to a bunch of rules governing the acquisition of territory. Purchase, gift with a reservation. And it doesn't actually mention marriage, though other deductions mention marriage. Yeah. And what it does is it then recites facts to say this fact is related to this claim. And so we establish this claim by showing all this chain of facts. So notice then that Henrich suggests that a deduction tries to trace a claim by establishing its origin. But this is establishing its origin, but that's not establishing a claim unless you have the quid iuris. So the first thing to note about it is that the distinction between quid facti and quid iuris is never about origins. Quid facti is about particulars, and so brings abstract connecting rules to bear on particulars, and particulars, when it comes to legal claims, are datable events in the past. And so in that way, yes, of course, if you and I have a contract, or rather, if I say you and I have a contract, it is always open to you to say, wait a minute, I don't remember signing that. When did that happen? And I then have to come up with the quid facti. That contracts must be performed. That you agree, that you and I have a contract. Show me when. But that's the facti, that's not the iuris. Okay. Second thing to note about this deduction is that it suggests that Kant was not entirely an admirer of the tradition of deduction writing. Because you might have noticed, those of you who are familiar with Kant's Toward Perpetual Peace may have noticed that the first two articles of Toward Perpetual Peace are actually repudiating each of the steps in Ludwig's deduction of the invasion of Silesia. Those of you who have read the Doctrine of Right will remember Kant's contempt for the jurist who provides the deduction after the invasion has begun. Kant does not think that this is an admirable genre of writing. What does he think it is, and why does he care about it? He thinks it is a way of establishing a synthetic connection. But notice something else. He also thinks the preliminary articles of Perpetual Peace make this clear, that one of the sources of war, and this is already clear in the Naturrecht Feierabend, and these are the student lecture notes from his course on natural right in 1784, that among the sources of war is the belief in the patrimonial state, in the belief, that is, that the concepts of private right, concepts of ownership, and concepts of exchange, and concepts of inheritance apply to states. But Kant rejects that too. But now notice what this shows us about the deduction tradition. It shows that in order to know whether these principles have application, you can only know that against the background of properly grasping the immutable principles of all lawgiving, which is to say that the quid iuris used by the jurist needs to itself be given a deduction. It needs to be shown that it is capable of a consistent use. Here's another way of making the point. As I said, something for everyone. Let's put this now in the vocabulary of the Critique of Pure Reason. The problem with the use of the titles of private right with respect to states, and thus with the idea of the patrimonial state, is that it leads to an antinomy. It is because these claims are unconstrained. But if they are unconstrained, then they do not admit of a consistent use. And so all that you can possibly get is a battlefield. So how do we solve the problem? The answer is we prevent the problem of conflict by making conflicts resolvable. How do we do that? By determining the true basis of the use of these juridical categories. If we understand the true basis of the use of these juridical categories, then we will see, first of all, what categories there are. And we will not fall into subrection, and we will not fall into conflict. Second, we will see the conditions under which those categories admit of a consistent use. And third, we will see whether that condition for the consistent use of those categories actually obtains with respect to a particular class. So I now want to go through the deduction of the titles of private right in a little bit more detail in order to explain how these steps fit. Before doing that, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the vocabulary of quid facti and quid iuris emerged in the 12th century with a reinvigoration of Roman law. In fact, there had been, prior to the 12th century, a three-part distinction between quid nominis, quid iuris, and quid facti. But in the 12th century, it was generally agreed that quid nominis, the question of classification, was itself a legal question, not a different kind. So whether this is a contractual claim or a proprietary claim, that is a legal question, and so has to be part of the quid iuris. But although it is part of the quid iuris, it is nonetheless part of it and needs to be done. And this is important in what follows. Okay, so Kant's deduction of the titles of private right begins with a distinction between claims with regard to what he characterizes as innate right, and claims with regard to what he characterizes as acquired rights. An innate right does not require an affirmative act to establish it. An acquired right does. But that is to say, as Kant will go on to say, that claims under innate right are, with regard to the claim against another, analytic in his proprietary terms. Well, what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example. Suppose that I grab you by the wrist. You are entitled, I'm not going to actually pull this off, this looked like a good example, but okay, you are entitled to peel my fingers off of you. Yeah. You're entitled to do that, but your entitlement to do that is just your right to your own person. That is just upholding the right that I violated. So the idea that neither of us is entitled to grab the other includes the entitlement that if one of us grabs the other can peel the other's fingers, the first one's fingers off. And so that doesn't add anything. So Marsha took me to a store earlier today, and I should buy that because that is what was wrong for this example. And I apologize for that. So I will have to make do with the water bottle. The apple is the traditional example because it is the Vulgate translation of the fruit from the book of Genesis and the Hebrew Bible, and it also figures in the Occamite discussion of the Franciscan vows of poverty. I wrap my hand around an apple. If you grab the apple out of my hand, just imagining that to be an apple, then you commit a wrong against my person. Why? Because the apple is connected to me, literally. And so you're interfering with me by pulling it out of my hand. On the other hand, when I have put the apple down, I guess I should call it a water bottle. When I have put the water bottle down, in order for you interfering with the water bottle to be a wrong against me, it must be that there is some synthetic connection between me and the water bottle. That is a synthetic a priori principle of right, and Kant says the general question of right is how are synthetic a priori principles of right possible? The answer is they are possible by showing that they are consistent with, because a consistent extension of the universal principle of right. The universal principle of right says that freedom must be limited to the conditions of its consistent exercise. It's a pure consistency requirement with respect to spatially embodied free beings. And then what we need then is a deduction, a way of establishing that this can be extended to something other than those free beings interact. We need, that is, a deduction of the synthetic principles, the rules that connect things with other things, connect people to objects, that connect people to the future performances of other people, and the things that connect people to the loyalty of other people, the non-self-dealing of other people. Okay, how are we going to get that? The answer Kant gives is it has, turns out, several stages. First step is a quaestio nominis, the question of classification. What we need to do is provide an exclusive and exhaustive division of the ways in which people can be related to something other than each other in a way that is consistent with right. How do we get the principle of division here? Kant helps himself with the results of the transcendental analytic. And he says, well, look, there are only three possible relations corresponding to the three categories of relation: substance, causality, and community. These are property, contract, and status. And so we can know that there are these three possibilities, and only these three possibilities. He actually later explains that You might think that a binary distinction between persons and things would give you a fourfold distinction, but the fourth case is actually empty. And so we can see that there must be only three categories of relation. But if that's right, then we know that this is, again, you might make what you will of that argument. Kant regards this as a decisive argument, that this is an exclusive division and that the members of this division, I'm sorry, an exhaustive division, and that the members of the division are mutually exclusive. And that means that it is a possible extension. It's a possible extension, and it's only a possible extension at this point. But it's a possible extension because it is an extension that does not introduce any contradictions by the mere fact of its extension. That does not show that it has application. In order to show that it has application, we need two more things. The first thing we need is a matter to which it applies. And so notice, again, returning to my example of the apple and or water bottle, we get this exact structure. I can only have a property right in relation to something that can exist apart from. I can't own my own body. I could cut my hair and then own my hair, but I can't own my own body. Why? Because it's not distinct from. So the only thing that could be the object of a property right is something distinct from. The only thing that could be the subject matter of a property right is a performance by another person. And the only thing that could be the matter of a status right is the loyalty of another person. But that means we need a matter to which it applies, and it can only govern those kinds of things. And so it can only govern, in the case of property, spatially individuated three-dimensional objects. Those are the only things that can be property. Notice how this is already making trouble for the patrimonial state, because the patrimonial state supposes that something other than a three-dimensional spatially individuated object can be an object of property. Okay, but now that we have all of these pieces in place, we can see that we still have not yet solved the problem, because we've got the fundamental distinction. We need the thing that can be apart from me. There are three ways things can be apart from me, but we don't yet know that this is all consistent with the freedom of everyone. It needs to have consistent application, and here I am going to telescope a long and complicated argument in order to note simply that the structure is clearest in the case of property. The problem about property is not that my having something as my own is inconsistent with the freedom of everyone. The problem about property is that the only way in which a synthetic principle, such as don't interfere with the property of others, can have application is if there is some transaction through which it has application to something in particular. The only way, that is, anyone can own something is if someone can acquire something. And they can acquire something from someone else, but that just pushes the problem back. The only way in which someone can acquire something is if they can acquire it from an unknown state. But how could that be consistent with the freedom of everyone? It used to be that here was this bottle of water, somehow, like Minerva from the hand of Zeus appearing full grown on the table, and you were free to deal with it as you saw fit. And somehow there has been this transaction such that you no longer. How can that be binding on you? That looks like a unilateral act. How can a unilateral act be consistent with the freedom of everyone? And Kant's answer is, it only can through an omnilateral authorization. Now, there's a lot to be said about how the omnilateral authorization works, but there's a structural point that I want to make here rather than going into the details of that, though I'm happy to answer questions about that if anyone has them. The structural point is that it turns out that unilateral acquisition could only be binding if it is an instance of what Kant calls a principle of division rather than a principle of aggregation. That is, only if we can think of it as authorized by everyone. And in order for it to be authorized by everyone, it would then be consistent with everybody's view. Now, again, the structure is what I'm interested in here. And the striking feature of this structure is that it shows us that there is a condition on the application of this consistent extension of the universal principle of right to the matter to which it applies. And then you have to show that that condition is satisfied. And Kant says the condition is satisfied only if we are in a rightful condition, that is, only if we share a common system of law. Now, again, you might doubt his claim that that condition is satisfied, but the structure of the argument is clear. He thinks that in order for me to be able to have a right to this water bottle, it must be the case that you, the people against whom I enjoy that right, share with me an omnilateral will authorizing property. And so we have the question of classification. We have the matter to which it applies. We have the condition of the application of that matter, of it to that matter, and we have the claim that that condition is satisfied. Once we see it that way, I just want to draw your attention to the fact we see that that's the exact structure of the B deduction. That is, so those are the, I have what I call an off print of the transcendental deduction because I have opened and closed each of my copies of the Geyer and Wood translation of the First Critique so many times that I have several that are just spilling out pages. And sometimes my students say, well, why are we doing these sections together? And so I get to hold it up and say, well, look, that's just how the book fell apart. But anyway, those of you who did not bring your off print of the transcendental deduction with you, I just want to draw your attention to what Kant said in section 26. Because in section 26, he says, in the metaphysical deduction, we have established what the categories are by establishing their complete coincidence with the logical forms of judgment. And so what I take that to show that, so that's what the metaphysical deduction, for those of you for whom this is not kind of what you think about when you go for a walk in the afternoon, is where Kant shows that categories and the logical forms of judgment are perfectly aligned, that there's a one-to-one correspondence, and that in some important sense, the categories are just the version of the logical table of judgments with respect to objects. And so just as in a categorical judgment, subject and predicate stand in a certain relationship, so the relation between a substance and its accident is a relation of inclusion. Just as in a hypothetical judgment, the relation between the first term and the second term is one of dependence, so too in a causal judgment, the relation between cause and effect is a relation of dependence. So too with respect to a disjunctive judgment, in which the terms exclude each other, so the category of community is object, substances excluding each other. So you have inclusion, dependence, exclusion. We have it with respect to term, with respect to concepts, and we can have it with respect to objects. So that's what the metaphysical deduction has shown. But that is to say, it has answered the questionnaires. It has shown that based on the supposedly established result that the logical table of judgments is exclusive and exhaustive and thus complete, it shows that the table of categories is exclusive and exhaustive and thus complete. And so it shows that this is a consistent extension of the logical forms of judgment to the case of objects. But to show that it is a consistent extension is not yet to show that we are entitled to. Because, of course, it could be a consistent extension that we're not entitled to. And indeed, that's what the transcendental dialectic is about. That is, it turns out that just as the rules of private right give you kind of a style international relations and constant war, so too, if you take the categories of the understanding and deploy them in the wrong place, they lead to antinomy, conflict, the battlefield of metaphysics. That's not it. That's not their proper application. So what's their proper application? First thing we need to establish, as we establish that you need the right matter, section 20 establishes that the categories apply only to intuition. Why? They need intuition in order to apply. They need intuition in order to apply because otherwise we don't have the distinction between holding the apple and having the apple. That is, we don't have the distinction between the bottle feeling heavy, or rather feeling pressure on my hand, and the bottle being heavy. And so it needs to be referred, the categories, the possibility of thinking about an object is only possible with respect to something in intuition, because only then can we draw the distinction that is required in order for that application. But notice, we've got that, and then, so there's a large literature on why the transcendental deduction doesn't stop after section 20. You can enjoy that literature at your leisure, but here's the answer. It's that has established the matter, but it has not established that the condition of possible consistent application has been established. It's an internally consistent set, but that doesn't show, and it could only apply to something given in intuition, but that doesn't show that it does apply. That's a necessary but not sufficient condition. And then in section 26, we get this hyper-compressed claim that, oh, well, that part's easy. Like kind of leaving it as an exercise for the reader. And why is that part easy? That part's easy because space and time are both intuitions themselves and the forms in which all other intuitions appear. If that's true, then there's only one space and there is only one time. And the unity of space and time means that the categories applied to intuitions within space and time have a unity imposed on them, have a consistency condition imposed on them. And so, therefore, we are entitled to use them, but only then. So notice, this makes it a juridical deduction. It answers the quaestio nominis. It then answers the quaestio iuris by showing the matter to which it applies without any particulars in it. It shows not merely that, but it shows the condition of that being a consistent application, and it shows that that condition is satisfied. And in so doing, of course, it shows that any use of it beyond that is illicit. And so it establishes a title, a way of connecting things to other uses. At the beginning of the transcendental deduction, Kant says that there are certain concepts which he describes as usurped. Notice, usurped is a legal and political term. This is no accident. And what are his examples? His examples are, of course, fortune and fate, for which no deduction can be provided. Now, a few things about this. The first is, notice that fortune and fate are usurped synthetic principles because they are offered in explanation of things. Notice also that at the conclusion of the analytic of principles, Kant announces that what this has shown is that, among other things, there is no fortune and there is no fate. Why has it shown that? Precisely because we have an exclusive and exhaustive classification and it wasn't on the list, and it couldn't be on the list. because there is no way of connecting things to other things that admits a portion of things. Okay, so I made a number of claims about what this was going to show. Let me first address the thing that it shows about the doctrine. Many people, most prominently Jeremy Waldron and Jaffa Polikophile, claim that the property argument is just incidental, and really the reason that Kant thinks that we need to leave the state of nature and enter a rightful condition is because we disagree. And if you think that that's why we need to do it, then as Polikophile in particular, I think, shows in considerable detail, that well, we disagree about bodies too. We disagree about the precise contours of bodies. We disagree about what counts as being careful enough around other people's bodies. And so she says, and that this is a recurring theme in attempts to make Kant less interested in private law than he is. We'll just put it that way, without naming any further names. But the thought is, well, therefore, we don't need to worry about the property argument. And so we can get the Kantian argument for the state, and then we don't need to worry about private law. We don't need to give private law a significant role. So this turns Kant into a kind of highly technical transcendental Lockean. And it's not that, except it's Locke without property, which is, again, a kind of a slightly alarming reading of the history of philosophy. So Alan says you can give them apparatus they didn't have, but you can't take their apparatus away. But anyway, here's the point about Kant. Kant says we need the united will because you need a principle of unity in order to account for a synthesis. With respect to your own body, there is no synthesis. If there is no synthesis, there is no argument for leaving the state of nature. And so this is, it seems to me, an interesting implication. Now a few implications with respect to the critique of pure reason. I'm mindful of the time, and so I will contain myself. The first thing to note is that all of the so-called imaginary subjective transcendental psychology or fictitious mental machinery is not part of Kant's argument. It's certainly true that Kant talks about the role of the imagination and talks about figurative synthesis, talks about the synthesis of reproduction and imagination, talks about the productive imagination. In doing all of those things, many readers have wanted to make Kant into someone who falls into some version of empiricism or psychologism. But notice, Kant tells us a number of things that cast doubt on this reading. And the juridical interpretation confirms that doubt. First of all, Kant tells us experience consists of judgments. It doesn't consist of sensations. It doesn't consist of whatever else there is. Second, he tells us that the imagination is the capacity to represent an absent object. And that means what he requires of the imagination. Well, obviously, it's something that our brains do. Yeah, but that's not what he's interested in, because he's interested in our entitlement to do it. The fact that we cannot help but do it, the kind of Strawson reading of Kant, that may be true. It may be that we cannot help but judge using the categories. But of course, that can't be Kant's argument. We can't help but get drawn into metaphysics too. And he thinks this is not a good reflection on us. This is something that we need to discipline. How do we discipline it? By seeing the conditions under which we can permissibly use these concepts. That is, by establishing our entitlement. And so all of the worries about the imaginary subject of transcendental psychology, they're just in the reader's imagination. This also, I think, lets us see the sense in which the argument, rather than being regressive in the prolegomena and future metaphysics, Kant tells us that he is presenting the argument there regressively, whereas in the critique it is progressive. In a wonderful article by Karl Amarex, Karl suggests, well, No, actually, the argument of the critique is regressive also because it's not a deductive argument. And it seems to me that the appropriate response to this is to say, well, no, there is a sense in which it is progressive. Why? Because you begin with a consistency principle, and then you progress to the application of it to a new class of possible things, using thing the most generic term. And then you identify the conditions under which you could be entitled to do that. And then you show that those conditions are satisfied. That is progressive in the sense that clearly contrasts with the regressive argument of the prolegomena, which says we have these synthetic a priori judgments, what do they presuppose? Just as in reading the Doctrine of Right, we work from the innate right of humanity in our own person up through acquired rights to the idea of public right, even though, of course, you could say, look at the structure of a tort action, it presupposes these structures. Yes, you can do it. You can do it regressively, but that doesn't mean that you can't do that progressively. Finally, it lets us redeem the wonderful turn of phrase at the end of the A deduction, according to which the understanding is the lawgiver of nature, and at the end of the B deduction, according to which the understanding prescribes laws to nature. Why is it the lawgiver? Let's go back to the way in which the synthetic a priori principle with which I began was the principle pactus sunt servanda. That is a principle of lawgiving. It isn't a particular law. That is, it is a principle through which particulars can be brought under law. So too, the rule that property is not to be interfered with. They are principles of lawgiving. The understanding prescribes laws to nature because it determines the categories. Of course, the categories still need to be applied to particulars. But as Kant says, remarking on chemistry, discoveries of chemistry, he says that they're really rules, not laws. The law-giving is the understanding because it is the thing that tells us things depend on other things. Stuff happens because of other stuff. And so that vocabulary is non-metaphorical. This should not come as a surprise because, as I noted at the beginning, the structure of the critique of pure reason and the structure of the doctrine of right are the same. They're both concerned with a problem of a conflict. They both solve that conflict through the idea of perpetual peace. And the critique of pure reason holds out the possibility of perpetual peace in philosophy because the only way in which peace is ever possible is under law. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We'll take our customary 3-minute break and then reconvene Q&A. Okay. Well, Alex, why don't you kick us off?
Thanks so much for the great talk.
Sorry, can I have your name?
It's Al. I'm sorry. Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate it, Steve. Thank you so much for the great talk. Had so many things with critique of reason. It was very interesting. But I just had a question. I guess but the main thing is that the right, the quid iuris, the right that we're establishing in the transcendental deduction that we're taking is to the objective reality, right? These principles, right? The categories to try to give our principles. And so, we have them as subjective principles of our thinking, right? And then you have to explain how justify the main justification is to how we're entitled to consider them to be part of objective reality, right? The structure of nature. And then nature is understood at the end of the transcendental deduction as sum total of appearances. And so I guess, can you say how your account is going to explain how we're justifying using them not merely as subjective principles or principles of judgment, right? Principles that we use in our judgment, but why they would structure nature, like objectively, why they're part of our objective reality.
Okay, so thank you for that. So write it down. That I'll give a short answer and then a long answer. So when we talk about objective reality, there's a question about what exactly is being claimed, particularly because, of course, both objective and reality are modal terms, and as you know, Kant has a view about modality and what it does and doesn't do. But so that's kind of the short answer. Slightly longer answer. The entitlement that needs to be established is the entitlement to use it in a way that makes the concept of objective reality have application. The worry about dialectical illusions is not that they are all false. It is that they are dialectical illusions in that they presuppose distinctions that they are unable to make out. And because of that, so let me just give you an example. In the case of the antinomy, the idea is that the world is a thing, and the world is not a thing in the relevant sense. And so these concepts have no application. Because they have no application, they generate these kinds of conflicts. Why? Well, because it is built into the structure in which this is posed. But if that's right, then notice that what Kant needs is a distinction between the occasions on which the use of the categories have what we can characterize as objective application and the conditions under which they do not. Now, there's a tradition in readings of Kant that take him to be concerned to reply to a certain kind of skeptic. And there is a way in which that's true, because it's certainly true that in multiple places, so there are parts of the transcendental deduction where he seems to be saying, well, look, the skeptical empiricist can't even state their position. And certainly in the second analogy in particular, he's saying the Humean position can't distinguish between a succession of appearances and an appearance of succession. And so all of that is true, but it's important to see that that is not an answer to the skeptic on the terms on which the skeptic proposes it. It is a critique of the terms on which the skeptic poses the challenge. And one way of putting the point, sometimes when I sometimes have this experience with someone who's worried about something, and I tell them I really don't think that's worth worrying about, and they'll say, actually, where actually is kind of asking for additional reassurance rather than asking a further substantive question. And there's the way in which Kant's response to the skeptic is, look, all you're doing is saying actually, because what I can show you is that the distinctions that we need to distinguish reality from illusion, for example, to distinguish true from false, those distinctions we are entitled to under the categories with respect to intuitions given in space and time. And that's what those distinctions come to. And so we have a consistent and coherent characterization of the concept of reality. And so we can say that this is real and that is illusory within experience. And then we can say, no, that It's not that dialectical illusions are like optical illusions. No, they're dialectical illusions. The thought is completely unconstrained there. If we can show that thought is constrained, then we have solved the problem. Now, let me make the point in a slightly different way. There's another way of thinking about the Kantian project, and this is what I call the T.H. Green, John McDowell approach, that basically says, oh, well, Kant has this anxiety. Whenever people use psychiatric terminologies in the history of philosophy, I really start to get nervous in the psychiatric vocabulary. But and needs to somehow bring things under control, as McDowell puts it, by showing there's some kind of friction. And no, that isn't it at all. It's rather that showing that this has consistent application. Why? Because what we started by asking about is whether we could be entitled to synthetic a priori judgments. We don't doubt that we are, so much as we don't understand how they're possible. How are they possible? That is, how could we be entitled to them? Well, they need to be consistent uses of judgment. Here, I've shown you how they can be consistent uses of judgment. If you then ask, yes, but are they objectively real? That's just like saying, but really? Actually, it doesn't get us any further, because that's the sense in which it is a system of transcendental idealism, because the question of whether it connects to something other than our ability to judge is a question that we couldn't be in a position to answer. And so objective reality has to be internal to it. But given that there's nothing extra anyway that is available to us, that isn't a problem. So that's good. Can I actually just say one more thing about the juridical case? If someone were to say, yes, I understand how you've established the validity of property rights or the principle pacta sunt servanda, but I want to know, do I really need to keep my promises? Do I objectively need to do it? And the answer is the kind of objectivity that matters here is objectivity in accordance with consistent rules governing the interaction of free beings. It's objective in that sense. Oh, but is it objective plus? The answer is objective plus is not a concept that we actually have.
David.
Yes, thank you. My question is just about private right. And in particular, the contrast with Locke and Hewitt Jaffa, because I was sort of losing the disagreement there.
Okay.
So important to her, how much this echoes Locke, I don't know, but important to her was the possibility of disagreement.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, there's a way of a Lockean reading of that, which is, well, not that good. That's something else that's less interesting. But is this a suggestion? So I don't know if this is friendly to you or not friendly to you. That well, the part of the problem is I'm thinking of notions of provisional right,
Yeah.
because you talk about innate right,
Yeah.
you have acquired right, but the weird category of provisional right,
Yeah.
Which has something to do with that transition. So I'm at that level, both kind of inside and outside. That the disagreement we could worry about with regard to property, with regard to what counts as our own body, say, oh no, once my hand is cut off, it's the severed hand. You know, my belt part of my body, because you can't get my belt off without moving around. Has that become part of my hair, my dandruff, blood that I've spilled? So, shaving. Okay. The worry is, one said, look, we have to have bodies as agents. Agents have to have material bodies, and they have to be able to be exposed to one another in causal relations, right? Space, time, all that. And so there must be some rights with the concept of body, ethically, politically, has to be defined. But what we get from that is highly, highly indeterminate. So the problem with having disagreements is not just there can be reasonable disagreements in the sense that people can be hideously ignorant or really hard call to make, but that there just is not a fine-grained enough fact of the matter. So the problem isn't just disagreement. Even in the cases where we agree, this is a convergence, it's a negotiation, but it's not coming to a common appreciation of a fact of the matter, because there is no fact of the matter, right? And so even if we happen to agree, right, on the limits as individuals, it's the wrong kind of agreement, right? That's a mere coincidence of views. And so we need something broader to fill in these concepts, right? The concept of what body is, what property is, what contract is, that gives it, as it were, determinate content, where what we've got from the universal principle of right, and the moral law that has anything to do with this, is just a schema. So if the worries about disagreement are understood that way, is this a similar task that you're worried about, or
Okay.
something else? Sorry, that was
Yeah,
too much.
no, that's very helpful. So my treatment of the kind of the Japa's position and Martin Stone and Rafiq Hassan come close to this in their recent article, and it was too compressed, but let me just expand a little bit. There is no doubt a question about agreement. It's no doubt that for Kant, there are casuistical questions with respect to bodies. Because of course, for Kant, as for everyone other than utilitarians, there are casuistical questions with respect to the application of general practical principles to particulars. And so the question of whether this falls within the scope of that principle or not is casuistical. Again, I mean, in the Doctrine of Virtue, Kant talks about the way in which you should comport yourself towards your own body, and then the question, what if I sell my hair for a wig? And that's a casuistical question because it requires judgment. Now, Kant tells us in the schematism that there are no rules for judgment. There can be no rules for judgment because there would be a regress if there were rules for judgment. And so it must be that there is something that is simply the application of a rule, which is not itself an instance of some further rule. And so obviously Kant is attuned to this, and obviously, equally obviously, the entire natural law tradition of which Kant is both an heir and a critic is attuned to this. This is Aquinas's determinatio, that we have these concepts and they need to be determined with respect to this particular. And we need, Aquinas tells us, an authority to tell us that. And you get the same argument in Anscombe. And so there's no way Kant wants to deny that. And there is no way that Kant wants to deny that if we have a legal system, part of its job is managing that, managing our right to our own person. And the Naturrecht Feyerabend actually has an extended discussion, which Achenwald, from whose textbook he taught, does not have, of problems of accession. That's cutting your hair, the relation between your shirt and your body, and so on. Kufendorf goes on for about 150 pages about accession. It was a big deal because, coming back to 18th century deductions, Kufendorf spent 6 months in jail during the war between Denmark and Sweden. It was about a series of islands. Those of you who've seen the movie Babette's Feast might wonder why anyone wanted those islands. Those of you who've taken the train from Copenhagen Airport to Malmo will have gone over one of those islands. They fought about it, and it was a war of accession. That is it more connected to Sweden? Is it more connected to Denmark? And so this is a huge issue in Roman law. And my favorite example, which Pufendorf goes on about for pages, if you own the paper, and I write on the paper, does that mean you now own the ink, or does that mean I now own the paper? Plainly, if you now own the ink, you have to reimburse me for the ink. Plainly, if I now own the paper, I have to reimburse. But what happened? So huge problems like that, and those are not particular to ink and paper or cows and calves or islands. They happen with bodies too. But crucial point, all that shows is that with respect to a bilateral transaction, there is an issue. That is, whether I own the shirt that you have just brought, or you cut your hair, I grab it. Do I own it or do you? That's a matter between us. It may be that you and I cannot actually solve that problem inter se, and it may be that we can. That's just contingent. And it may be that the right thing for us to do is to ask some third person to resolve the dispute for us. And it may be that the prudent thing for us to do is to have a bunch of general rules for people to do that. However, that does not show a priori that we must unite together under an unilateral will. That shows only the Lockean thing, that with respect to our rights, which are indeterminate in nature, that we would do better with respect to those rights to have some institutional structure, which is to say, that gives us a Thomistic argument. It does not give us a Kantian argument. It's a Thomistic argument. It is an argument of Thomistic practical prudence. You get an argument like this in Suarez, you get a kind of argument like this in Grotius with it, and that's not Kant at all. Kant wants to show that law is a priori necessary in the very idea of the distinction between freedom and violence. How can it show that? It can only show that with respect to what is mine or yours. That is, it's not merely the internal mine and yours. It must be the external mine or yours. Because the thing about an acquired right is that it could be yours or it could be mine. I could have made the promise to you, but instead I made it to Alan. I could have acquired this water bottle, but Mike could have acquired it just as well. Who is it? That is a matter of what happened. What rights you have depends on what happened. We need an unilateral authorization because we have synthetic rules governing transactions. With respect to your own body, there are not transactions in the same way. There are indeterminate application of rules. Here's a slightly different way of making the same point. Your right to your own body is indeterminate in its application, but normatively fully binding in the absence of public legal institutions. That is, now you might say, well, wait, how can you have a rule if it doesn't tell you what to do in every instance? And the answer is, well, ethical rules are like that all the time. But further, that it does that your right to your own body is indeterminate in its application, but does not depend on sharing a public legal order with others. It's not that in a state of nature you do not have a right against battery. There might be unclear cases, but I am not allowed to throw my water bottle at you. I guess in a state of nature, it's not mine. Not allowed to throw this water bottle at you. And that is a wrong, I'm not allowed to grab your wrist. No amount of subtle casuistry, no amount of what Kant calls sleuthing in the archives will make it the case that I am allowed to grab your wrist. On the other hand, in the absence of a shared public legal order governed by the principle of freedom under law, we have no right to this thing. It's not that, now you might say, oh, but I have a provisional right, but a provisional right, Kant says explicitly, is a right that awaits. That is, it's like the provisional government. A government in exile is a provisional government. The provisional IRA calls itself that. Why? Because it lacks rightful force, but it is the thing that could be rightful force. In the same way, so Kant actually in the Vorarbeiten for the private right sections of the Doctrine of Right actually goes through all of the categories. And with respect to modality, he says that possibility is provisional right, actuality is acquired right, necessity is innate right. Why? Because the bindingness of innate right is the condition of the bindingness of anything else at all, even though it might be unclear in its application. Provisional right is not binding, but could be binding. Acquired right is binding because the condition of its bindingness is provided for by the uniting will. But you do not need the omnilateral will to have a right to your own person. You do need an omnilateral will to have a contractual right. That's the structure of the
I'm gonna abuse my authority.
Okay.
To ask a question because it follows up a tiny bit from this. So I'm really interested in this sort of idea you have to explain of this idea of, one only has the right to the water bottle if it's authorized by everyone through the shared public conception of law. But could you expand a little bit more on the sort of theoretical justification that Kant gives to this picture? And I guess I sort of channeling my inner Locke, not that I'm a Lockean, but it seems maybe a strange implication of this Kantian position that if we don't have the shared public system, we can't make sense of having rights to sort of individual things. I mean, you can imagine Locke saying, well, we don't have this complex and subjective system that's set up according to the principles of right yet, but somehow mix my labor with the water bottle or find it. Is that not sufficient in context to say? I was just wondering, I guess.
Sure.
Hear a little bit more of the details.
I'm happy to fill this up. It's one of my favorite things to discuss. So
Oh, that's the right question.
Yeah. So thank you. So I mean, I always thank people for their questions because the questions have all been interesting, but this is like a gift. So
Okay.
all right. So
I just want to know why I should be a Kantian.
okay. So it should be because it's the only consistent position. So here's the basic thought.
Mm-hmm.
The key to any kind of justification with respect to rights is showing that it is consistent with the freedom of everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's go back to the what is that to me question.
Mm-hmm.
Locke says, I mixed my labor with the thing. So there are two ways of putting it. Kant says both of them in different places. The first thing that he says is, let's just back up with Locke. Locke claims of the significance of my mixing my labor comes from the fact that the earth was given to human beings in common for their self-preservation, and in the Naturrecht Feierabend responding to the way in which Achenball reads the Ulpian precepts. He thinks that the first Ulpian precept, honesta viva, which is living honorably, which Kant turns into an imperative, live honorably, but Achenball takes it to be saying not that, but to be saying instead, preserve yourself. And talking about the plank of Carneades, Kant says, what is his self-preservation to me? If we give up on concepts of freedom, everything gets confused. Why is that? Well, because of course, each person's self-preservation is not a consistent set. That's why the plank of Carneades, that's the two sailors struggling over a plank that will support a drowning sailor struggling over a plank that will support only one of them. They each seem to have a claim. And in that kind of situation, although this is not what Kant says, this is what Marx says, when you have equal claims of right, force alone will decide. But that is to say, to put it back in the Kantian idiom, there's no right if you can have antinomian claims of right. And so self-preservation is a problem. But now, labor mixing is another version of the exact same problem. Because of course, the fact that you put your effort into something is, first of all, nothing to me. As Rousseau puts it, I didn't ask you to mix your labor with it. But we can also note that the Locke gives the example of the person chasing the hare and then someone else comes along. And the Roman jurist Tribatius is the only person other than Locke in the history of Western legal thought who has ever thought that putting effort into something gives you a claim to the thing. Why? Well, because if you're dealing systematically with possible conflicts, there's always effort on both sides. And so it gives you no way of having a consistent resolution. This is just a formal systematic problem. So now, what does that show? The first thing it shows is that the acquisition of the thing needs to be binding on everyone. A contract right is in a way an Easter case, but because a contractual right is just a matter of the parties changing how things stand between the two of them. Doesn't change the rights of anyone else. You and I can't make an agreement that denies some other person some right. Appropriation of property. It used to be available for all, and now suddenly I get to determine the terms in which you use it. And the question is, how could that be possible? And the answer is, it could only be possible if it is a matter of an authorization by him. Now, we can make the same point with respect to enforcement, because rights are by their nature enforceable. That's why Locke thinks that there must be an executive right in the state of nature. Since you're channeling your inner Lockean, I'll channel my outer Kantian. And the appropriate response is, if rights are enforceable, enforcement needs to also form a consistent set. Otherwise, it's simply one person dominating another. It's just the right of the stronger. If you, I mean, this is picking up on something that David said, if you yield to my claim because I'm bigger than you, that isn't a claim of right. It may turn, I might be right on the merits, but it isn't based on the merits. It is based only on force. So too, if I trick you or I charm you or anything else, it isn't a matter of how my power of choice stands in relation to yours. The only way it can be is if we are subject to public legal institutions such that whether a right is enforced or not is a matter of law, where the law is common to both of us. So too with respect to judgment, bringing the law to bear on particulars. I don't need to defer to your judgment. You don't need to defer to my judgment. Of course, if we disagree, we could appoint a wise person as an arbitrator. But of course, if I don't agree with what the arbitrator does, that's not binding on me unless there is an on the lateral standpoint. What is it for a standpoint to be on the lateral? It can be characterized both negatively and positively. Characterized negatively and on the lateral standpoint is one that is not identical with in its content or dependent upon the content of anyone in particular standpoint. That is, it is the standpoint of no one in particular, but that is merely negative. Here's the positive version. It is the standpoint of everyone. What is it to have the standpoint of everyone? That is a matter of the standpoint depending exclusively on its publicity and not on the private purposes of anyone in particular. Think about the role of a public official. Public official is charged with addressing some question. Public officials always have discretion, that is, they're supposed to exercise judgment. Here are the factors they are supposed to consider in determining the matter before them. In determining that matter, they are not allowed to act for inappropriate purposes. Notice that we can build up from that idea a second idea, which is that as a private person, you can do whatever you want unless it is expressly prohibited. As a public official, you can do nothing at all unless it is expressly permitted. But once we have that idea, we see that the idea of a public unilateral standpoint is the idea of purely public authorization merely for the purpose of providing a rightful condition to everyone. And when we have that positive picture in view, we can see how that could authorize each of us to do the public act of making something our own. Now, your question ended with asking, but how can it be that we can't make sense of contractual arguments or property rights or whatever in the absence of public legal institutions? To which Kant's answer, no, we can make perfectly good sense of them. That is, we can think them in a state of nature. It's just that they're not binding in a state of nature. They're intelligible, but their bindingness is what we needed, because their bindingness is the only way in which they can provide an answer to, well, what is your having appropriated that thing to me question? The answer is they are binding because they are the condition of all of us enjoying freedom consistently together.
Thank you. Very good.
So this is just a question of information. You made a remark about Auckland and Franciscan poverty remarks that were two cases for me to follow. Would you
Okay.
restate it?
It was just that it was merely about apples. That Occam's example in the letter to the Friars Minor is of an apple. And so I was just talking about it apropos of Kant using the example of the apple, because the apple is everyone's favorite example of property. Partly because the apples are naturally occurring, but that's all I said. So.
Yeah, thank you for a very rich talk. It's so rich that I found myself at various points having questions that I now can't grasp. So here's the way I want to ask the question. I want to make a series of claims that I'm inclined to make whenever I talk about the notion of a deduction.
Okay.
And you'll either agree with them or disagree with them. If you disagree, I'll be interested in why. And if you agree, I'd like to have some information about how they fit into the story.
Okay.
When I teach about deductions, one point I always want to make is a deduction is a justification for something of which Kant thinks we already have possession. But there might be a question of whether we have a right to what we possess. I think this applies to the category. It applies in the groundwork, third part of the groundwork to the moral law, and so it's supposed to fit all these deductions. Now, this relates to the distinction between quid iuris and quid facti. There, the idea, I take it that the quid facti is the question how empirically, as a matter of fact, I came into the possession of the thing that I have possession of. And the quid iuris is a question of by what right do I have possession of it? And the deduction is supposed to answer the quid iuris. Now, I'm wondering if what I've said, agrees with you, and if it does, then, tell me how it fits. And if there's something I'm missing or getting wrong, I wish you'd tell me that.
Okay, thank you. So there is a way in which it can be rendered consistent with what I said, but I think on the issue of our having possession and the quid facti, I think I disagree with your way of putting it. And here's the way to think about it. The quid iuris on the traditional Roman legal understanding is the rule connecting something to something else. That is the rule that, say, contracts are to be kept. And given that that is what it is, then what Kant is interested in providing philosophical deductions for are these various quid iuris principles that we use. Now, there is a way in which you can say, well, we already have possession of them. But there are two things to say about that. The first is there's a sense in which that's true, because Kant is not actually interested in the kind of boggled skeptical challenge that says, oh yeah, but are you sure that contracts are to be kept, or are you sure about cause and effect? He wants to understand how these principles apply and how we are entitled to them. So you can say, oh, well, we are in possession of it. But there's another way in which, crucially, the notion that Henrich uses of quid iuris being a matter of justifying a possession that we have has two fundamental problems. The first problem is that as a matter of legal history, you get, and indeed Putter's book of deductions, to which Henrich refers, is filled with deductions and counter deductions. Because of course, these are legal arguments. And usually they're war manifestos, because these people are writing in a Grotian tradition where there are as many grounds of war as there are legal actions in private law. And so you're asserting a claim to something which you may not possess. And so indeed, Frederick's claim to Silesia is not saying I have good possession. Now, of course, it's true that he invaded at the time, but had he put it forward before he invaded, it's not that it becomes a deduction at the point at which he invades. And so that's part of the juridical structure. The more important philosophical point is that the things for which Kant sees the need to provide a deduction are themselves synthetic a priori principles, ways of connecting things to other things. And what he wants to show is that this way of connecting things is valid. But to show that, he does not need a quid fact, because what a quid iuris does, and this the Roman legal sources are completely clear on, is it connects a datable event to another datable event. And so the question is, are we entitled to connect things in this way? And so the quid facti is never a possession. The quid facti is always some datable event. So let's go back to Frederick's deduction. Our common ancestor, Georg, acquired Silesia by purchase in 1524. The point isn't that that is supposed to provide a justification because he now has it. Of course, it figures in establishing a claim to possess something, but what the quid facti is the validity of that purchase. But the quid facti is the fact of that purchase, which then connected with the principle pactus sunt servanda means that he has acquired good title. I mean, you need other private law principles like the idea that with the puzzling but fundamental private law principle that a bilateral transaction can transfer a in rem right, that is a right against everyone else, such that I was the owner before and now you're the owner, and wait a minute, that changes our relations to everyone else. How is that possible? Easy to explain in legal terms, but the point is what the principle does is connect datable event to datable event, which is of course what the principle of causality does, connects datable event to datable event. How could it do that? It could only do that subject to a condition and so on. So I don't actually think that the point of providing a quid iuris ever turns on us having the quid fact. And again, one way of seeing this is that the role of the quid iuris is to make sense of the availability of the relevant concepts in order to resolve a dispute. But that means that the relevant concepts, the concept of private right in the legal case, concepts of general metaphysics in the metaphysical case, those are, as it were, available to both sides of the dispute. The question is, how are these kinds of things connected to these other kinds of things? Or to put it in the most general way, how does this stuff happen how is this connected with that? But to ask that kind of question requires that we vindicate the connection and the idea that we are in possession of those kinds of connections. It's not that somehow we don't have them. It's just that we don't have them in the way in which anyone possesses anything in any recognizable sense of possession. It's not that we possess the principle that contracts are to be kept, or the principle that property is not to be interfered with in the way in which I have my God. And the problem with Henrich's use of the analogy is he's imagining that somehow we have the categories in the way in which the example he discusses it most like Putter wrote a deduction for the Baron of Zedwitz. Zedwitz was a principality beside Bohemia. The king of Bohemia claimed to rule over Zedwitz, and Putter's basic argument is no, you don't really have a claim over it. Why? Well, because you didn't enforce religion, you didn't set the calendar, and so you didn't exercise the incidence of ownership. But if you read it that way, the point is you didn't do the things you need to do to perfect your acquisition. And if that's the structure, then the deduction can't be about possession. It's all, the quid iuris can't be about possession. It's all about the rules to establish possession.
Yes, I follow up just one. I think you're right. The picture I was painting was basically the Henrich picture. That's probably, that's probably where I got it actually. And what I would take away from your reply is something like this: that it is misleading to think that we're trying to justify a possession, because of course the whole question is whether we rightfully do possess it. I mean,
Yeah.
These are things that we usually regard as possessions, but possessions that might be put in question.
Yeah.
See, I mean, that through the first two parts of the groundwork, he is almost obsessively worried that morality might be a cobweb of the brain.
Right.
And in the third section, he is trying to put that doubt to rest, and that's what he calls a deduction of the of both freedom and of the moral law. Okay, so that fits. I mean, we might think, that we do use the categories all the time.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we possess them, but but they're only interested in the problem we're addressing because we might worry that we don't really have rightful possession.
Yes.
And the way that it might fit the notion of the quid facta is how we, in fact, acquired this, at least in the case of many of the principles in the first critique. That thought might be connected to the thought that, well, we could give, especially if we were like Hume, we could give a psychological account of how we came to make causal judgments. I think Hume might even be able to say that, given the principles of human nature, how we couldn't avoid it.
Yeah.
Right? We couldn't help it. But the question might still arise, and Hume is certainly very, clearly aware of it. Even so, do we have a right to it?
Yes, so,
Yeah.
so I guess a couple of thoughts. The first is, so yes, certainly Hume, Kant says that the famous law gives a physiological deduction and thinks that he gets the categories of general metaphysics, and Hume is more careful and sees that he doesn't. So Hume doing it physiologically, Locke doing it physiologically, thinks he succeeds and falls into enthusiasm. That is, he thinks that we have an unmediated relation to some metaphysical reality. Whereas Hume falls into skepticism because he sees we can't get that.
Yeah.
But they're both doing the wrong thing because they're both trying to explain the origin of it in that sense.
Yeah.
But the origin is not what we're interested in. Now, do we want to say that this means we're in possession of it? And my hesitation about that is not to say that we don't have it, but rather to start with the battlefield of metaphysics and to worry about the general question of the critique of whether it's possible to have metaphysics as a science. And here he says we can't make do with merely historical knowledge. There's actually this beautiful passage I'm not going to remember which of the logic lectures, where he basically says that some sciences can make do with merely historical knowledge. He says navigation can make do with merely historical knowledge. That is, the Ptolemaic navigator and the Copernican navigator end up in the same place because all they need is the star chart. But that is of no use to us with regard to their future use. He says the merely historical jurist is fully ruined as a judge, even more so as a legislator. Why? Because what we want to know is not just, are we allowed to do this? We want to know how this apparatus can be brought to bear on resolving disputes. And the answer is, to answer that question, we need to know when it can. And it only can with respect to the conditions of space and time. And so another way of putting it, the problem with the Humean answer is that the Humean answer that is also true of the temptations of metaphysics. Human reason finds itself posing questions it can't answer. This is built into the structure of human reason. If it's built into the structure of human reason, then the we can't help it argument explains why we do it. Are we entitled to do it? No, not everything to which we find ourselves irresistibly inclined to do are we entitled to do. That is why we have a criminal law, among other things. But also, that is why we have a critique of pure reason. Because what we need to do is understand the conditions under which that the ways in which we think about things actually are something we could be entitled to do. That is, whether they could be exercises of judgment that are possibly consistent with the requirements of judgment in general. And so we have possession of speculative metaphysics too. I mean, we have it, in the way in which you fetch water with a sieve, but we still, in some sense, have it. Whereas the Kantian point is that we're not entitled to do it. Just one more version of the same point with respect to right. You look at the international law as described by the miserable comforters, Roches, Pupendorf, and Vattel. Conspicuously absent from the list is the most important of those, which is Wolff, who is, of course, the target of so much of Kant's metaphysical critique. And all of them say, well, look, this is what we do, this is how we do things, and we need these categories to do it. And the answer is, yes, you do, but you're not entitled to. When we establish the entitlement without reference to our possession of it, of course, we'd never get started if we didn't already know, if we didn't already say, these are the concepts that we use. I wonder if they're any good.
Yeah.
But that doesn't show that our actual use of them figures in their vindication. It's rather that our actual use of them makes them an issue for us.
Okay. Now I see the connection between Kant and the law. The critique is as important.
Yes.
Well, kind of good timing. We're out of time, but we've also run out of questions. So please join me in thanking our speakers.